Hi, my name is Dan Fleming and I'm the Dean of Studies at the Broken Bay Institute and lecturer in Theology and Ethics there also. And it's my great joy to be with you for our final session, session 8 of Decoding the Code, which is entitled Making the Catholic Ethical Vision Real. Our primary purpose in this final session of our time together is different to that of sessions 2 to 7 in that what we're going to be doing is trying to draw together the threads of our course, the threads of the time together, the threads of the information that we've gathered together and the wisdom that we've gained as a group in order to provide ourselves with a launching pad then to go back into the practices of what it is we do as professionals working in health and aged care. So the session's going to run a little differently in that I'm not going to be giving any additional content as such, but inviting you to reflect in a critical way on the journey that you've travelled through across the course. In some ways, this is the other end to session 1, where we began to ask questions as a group about those ethical issues that we encounter in the context of our health and aged care environments, and also start to explore the sources on which we draw in order to reason through some of those ethical situations and scenarios. Now, what I want to do in order to help us to revisit that session 1 and then also draw together the wisdom that we've come across as we've journeyed through the course together is actually return to a theme that we discussed early on in session 1. And that was the vision of conscience that is articulated within the Catholic tradition. You might remember way back in session 1 when we discussed conscience as a threefold phenomenon, which is part and parcel of what it means to be a human person. The first dimension of conscience, as we discussed in that first session, was that conscience is an inescapable, universal and unavoidable call to responsibility. And as the great Vatican II document Gaudium et Spes says, it is the voice of God which echoes in our hearts. That call to responsibility of itself, though, doesn't prescribe any particular moral norms. It forces us to go forward and seek out what is true and what is good, and therefore how we respond. And that was the process of what we referred to as conscience 2, moral science, seeking out what is good, trying to understand the good, trying to understand what it means to respond to that ethical call, and going on from that, how then I should act. In many ways, our time together has been an example of conscience 2. It's been an example of working in dialogue with the Catholic tradition of which we are a part, in order to try and discern the ethical content of that tradition and how it is that that applies both in terms of the specific issues we come across in our healthcare sector and also in terms of the general ambience of the institutions in which we work as well. Because remember that one of the key themes of our time together has been that ethics can't be reduced only to specific loaded situations that are the business of the hospital ethics committee to talk about and give advice on, but also that ethics is part and parcel, that universal call to responsibility is part and parcel of everyday life and all of our engagements in the social sphere. So what I'd like to invite you to do now is reflect on how it is that the course as a whole has operated in that way, has guided you as an individual in the context of your community through that process of conscience 2, that process of seeking out what is good and trying to understand it better in dialogue with the Catholic tradition. You could think back to the titles of the sessions that we work through. The first one was the questions and situations which give rise to ethics. The second, the groundwork of the Catholic ethical vision, sources and themes, a session in which we considered some of the underlying sources and ideas which give rise to what we've been discussing as Catholic ethics. We also talked about the centre of the Catholic ethical vision in the understanding of human dignity way back in session 3. And only after the point of actually establishing that understanding of an ethical tradition and ethical vision, did we then go on to consider some of the specific issues that arise in the context of health and aged care. So we discussed the human person, relationships and the search for meaning in session 4, sexuality, the beginning of life, and the code of ethical standards in session 5, aged care, the end of life and the code of ethical standards in session 6, and research ethics, the principle of cooperation and the code of ethical standards in session 7. So we've covered a lot of terrain in this course, and what I'd like to invite you to do now is, in just a moment, pause this presentation and go back and revisit some of your journey through the course. What I'd like to suggest that you do is 3 things before you resume the rest of this presentation. The first one is to go all the way back to session 1 and to review the posts that we put up online, especially your own posts, remembering that our task there was to say something about ourselves, of course, but also to say something about some of the ethical situations, scenarios, problems, and in some cases dilemmas that you come across in the context of your work in health or aged care. And when you look at those, I'd like you to think of a couple of things. The first one is, has the course provided you with some tools in dialogue with the Catholic tradition to think through those ethical issues in a more refined, in a deeper way? And if so, you might like to jot down some of those things. The second one is, are there other ethical issues or ethical problems that you would raise now that you might not have noticed at that early stage of the course? One of them perhaps could be that ethics isn't just about those limit situations where we have to make calls about life and death, but about the whole ambience of our lives. And the third thing I'd like to suggest that you do is get out your copy of the course outline and go through the sessions one by one, jotting down a couple of words or a sentence for each of those sessions about what your primary learnings were from each of them. So I'd invite you to pause this presentation now. It will still be available when you get back, and have a look through those 3 things. Going back to session 1, looking at your contributions and the group's contributions in terms of raising some of the ethical issues and scenarios located in your work. Thinking about what other questions you would raise now that you didn't raise or perhaps didn't notice then. And thirdly, going through the course outline step by step to have a look at each session and what your learnings were from that session. So now that you've reviewed your journey through the course, we come to a point at which we begin the task of session 8, making the Catholic ethical vision real. And as I mentioned in the introduction, what that means is taking all of these threads of what your learnings have been in theory throughout the course and considering what they might mean in practice as you graduate, in a sense, from this community of learning back into your environment of professional practice in health or aged care. Now, of course, I'm sure that throughout the duration of the course you've already been thinking of these practical applications, and it's been wonderful to see the discussion about that that's been going on in the midst of our online learning community. But now's our chance to formalise that a little more in terms of the final reflection paper that you're all going to be writing as the final step of the compulsory components to complete our Decoding the Code program. What we are, in a sense, doing in this final session is the work of that third dimension of conscience, which I haven't mentioned yet in this presentation. Recalling that the first dimension is that fundamental universal call to responsibility, that we must respond to that ethical call on our lives in some way. The second dimension, which we've been occupied with throughout the course, is that search for what is true and what is good in the context of the various scenarios that we come across in our professional lives, in dialogue with, in our case, the Catholic tradition. But those two alone are worth nothing if we don't move to the third stage. And the third stage of conscience, conscience 3, is the decision to commit ourselves to a particular way of being in the world, to particular character dispositions, to particular kinds of actions. And when we work in an institutional context, when we in our leadership roles within our institutions also commit to making those institutions places which are infused with the ambience of the ethical vision that we've been talking about thus far. So how does the course then translate for you back into your current context? This is praxis in the best sense, in that we've begun with our practical action as professionals in this space. We've moved into a theoretical mode over the last 7 sessions, and now we move back into a more refined vision of practical application of what all this means in the context of our professions. So that's what I'd like you to think about when you engage with that final reflection paper. You've got between 500 and 1,000 words to write down your key learnings from Decoding the Code and how it is that they're going to infuse your professional practice from here on in. And I'd like to invite you to use that 1,000 words however it best suits you. But make sure that when you're doing it, you're linking your ideas clearly to the content that we've been grappling with throughout the course and how it is that that's practically going to relate to your life after the course as well and your practice after the course as well. Without those two dimensions, the theoretical framework and the practice, it will come across as a little bit lopsided. That's my invitation to you. In a sense, what it becomes then is a bit of a mission statement for yourself. How is it that I am going to put these things into practice so as it doesn't just become a head trip, it doesn't just become a book on the shelf that I've learnt some more about, and that the Code of Clinical Ethical Standards then becomes a living resource for you. Decoding the Code has been a process of trying to give you access to that rich and brilliant resource in order to make it a real part of your professional work within health or aged care. The only other thing that I'd like to mention at this point is that we also have an optional webcast in this session by Professor Bernadette Tobin from St Vincent's Health in Sydney. And this is an excellent session which considers the role of a hospital ethics committee in the context of dealing with some of the issues that you come across in the context of your work. This is a very important session, and you might remember way back in session 1 us discussing that we can't outsource our ethics to the hospital ethics committee. We can't pretend that they're the ones who deal with ethical issues and we don't. Ethics is part of the ambience of our organisations, of our engagement with staff. And as I said to one group in the first session, ethics is just as much about the advice the Hospital Research Ethics Committee gives as it is about the manner in which they deliberate on that advice, the manner in which they discuss and debate things amongst themselves as a committee. So hopefully in some of your reflection papers we'll see some of that organisational ambience come out as well, that ethics is about more than specific situations. But nevertheless there are situations which call for concrete ethical guidance and call for some expertise that we ourselves might not have. Decoding the Code hasn't been set up, as we made clear very early on, to give you every answer to every situation. And that's where it's crucially important for you to be able to draw on the wisdom of bodies such as ethics committees within the context of your institutions and the other professional ethicists that you have around your systems to be able to seek out guidance where there are things that you are unsure of. So I commend you to have a look at Bernadette's wonderful presentation, which acts as a great rounding out of the task that we've been occupied with throughout Decoding the Code. On behalf of Catholic Health Australia and the Broken Bay Institute, thank you for your participation in Decoding the Code. It's been a great joy for me, and I know for others, to journey with you throughout this course. And my hope is, and this is a hope shared amongst the reference group, those who put together this program, that your learnings within the context of this course ultimately enrich your professional practice within the context of the Catholic institution and tradition of which you are a part. That you've been able to see the richness of that tradition in terms of its vision of the human person and what that means for how we act and how we deal with human vulnerability, how we respond to human vulnerability in the context of health and aged care, and also how that vision infuses the ambience of everyday life just as much as it does the way in which we deal with particular ethical issues. So thank you for your participation. It's been a very rich learning experience for me also. And I look forward to reading your reflection papers and hopefully keeping in touch after we finish. Thank you.